Let's be real. You've probably seen them everywhere online. Memes, videos, comment threads, all making arguments that God doesn't exist. Well, today, we're going to dive into 8 of the most common ones you'll find floating around. We're going to walk through a source that really puts these modern objections under the microscope to see if they actually hold up. Our source kicks things off with this really powerful metaphor. It says that a lot of these popular arguments against God are like styrofoam. From a distance, they might look solid, like a block of concrete, but get up close and you realize they're actually super light, fragile, and, well, they can't handle much pressure. So let's see if that's true. Let's do some scrutinizing. All right, first up, we're tackling 2 of the biggest objections out there. These aren't about nitpicking historical details or anything like that. Nope. These are about the very nature of reality, consciousness, and what we can even claim to know for sure. Okay, this first one is a heavy hitter, and it's an argument that really connects on an emotional level. The idea is pretty simple. We humans are terrified of death, of oblivion. So we invented this story about God and an afterlife to make ourselves feel better. It's just a comforting lie, because in reality, death is the final curtain call. But here's where our source flips the script. To say with absolute certainty that death is the end, well, that's not a small claim. To know that for a fact, you'd need to have some pretty incredible, almost godlike knowledge yourself. You'd have to know everything there is to know about consciousness, you'd need a complete map of any and all non-physical realities, and of course, you'd have to know for sure what happens after we die. The author's point is that saying death is the end isn't skepticism. It's a massive claim of its own, one that requires a kind of omniscience. Next up is one you've definitely heard before. The argument goes something like this. Look at all the thousands of religions in the world. They all contradict each other, they can't all be right, so the most logical conclusion is that they're all wrong, right? If there was one true God, wouldn't we all have one clear religion? But our source text turns this whole idea on its head. I mean, think about it. We disagree about everything, politics, economics, even science. But that doesn't mean there's no truth to be found in those areas. The existence of counterfeit money doesn't mean real money doesn't exist. In fact, from the Christian perspective quoted here, a world that is spiritually fallen or broken is exactly where you'd expect to find all sorts of confusion and competing claims about God. Okay, so that leads us into our next section, where we shift gears a little bit. We're moving from what's real to what's fair. These next 3 objections really get into questions about morality and justice. Basically, is God fair, and are we really responsible for our actions? And this one hits right at our sense of justice. It's the cosmic lottery argument. If getting to heaven means believing in the right religion, but you're just born into one by chance, well, how is that fair? It seems like a just God wouldn't set up a system based purely on luck of the draw. So the author argues this objection is built on a few really big assumptions that might not be true. First, it assumes God judges you based on your zip code instead of how you responded to the truth you actually had access to. Second, it assumes where you're born is totally random, not part of a bigger plan. And third, it pictures God's judgment as this simplistic black and white affair, not something deeply nuanced and personal. The source says that Christian teaching itself actually pushes back against all 3 of these ideas. All right, now for a very modern objection, one that pulls from psychology, genetics, and our understanding of trauma. If our brains are wired a certain way, or if our upbringing was terrible, how can we truly be held responsible for our actions? Aren't we just products of our environment and our DNA? In this slide really gets to the heart of the author's response. The idea isn't to ignore all those factors beyond our control. Not at all. In fact, the Christian view, according to the source, is that God sees and understands all of it. Every genetic marker, every childhood trauma, every bit of it. But it holds that intention with the idea that we're still responsible for the choices we do have, within the capacity that's actually ours. Responsibility is always proportional. And that brings us to the ultimate philosophical challenge, determinism. This is the big one, the idea that free will is just an illusion. If every single thought, every decision is just a chemical reaction in our brain, a long chain of cause and effect going back to the Big Bang, then how can anyone be praised or blamed for anything? To tackle this, the author brings out a famous argument from the philosopher Alvin Plantinga. And it's a bit of a mind-bender, but it goes like this. If our brains are just the product of unguided evolution, then they were selected for one thing and one thing only, survival, not for finding abstract philosophical truth. So Plantinga asks a killer question. If our brains are just survival machines, Why on earth should we trust them to be right about a complex idea like determinism? Let's break that down. If determinism is true, you're not really reasoning your way to that conclusion. Your brain chemicals are just fizzing in a predetermined way. That means every belief you have, including the belief in determinism itself, is just the result of a long, mindless biochemical accident. So if that's the case, you have zero good reason to think your belief in determinism is actually true. You see the problem? The argument basically eats its own tail. It's like sawing off the very branch you're sitting on. All right, for our final 3 objections, we're zooming out. We're going to look at some big picture arguments about the universe itself, the whole concept of morality, and the psychology of why people believe in the first place. You've definitely heard this one. It's the classic "science has explained it all" argument. We've got the Big Bang. We've got evolution. It's all just physics and random chance. So what's left for God to do? Science has basically made God redundant. But the author argues that this objection confuses 2 totally different questions. Sure, evolution might be a great explanation for how life developed once it was here, but it doesn't even begin to touch these deeper questions on the slide, like why is there a universe at all instead of nothing? Where did consciousness come from? Why do logic and math even work? The source claims that naturalism just doesn't have the tools to answer these fundamental questions about reality. Now, this one is really fascinating. It's an attempt to use morality against God. It essentially puts God on trial, looks at actions in the Old Testament or the problem of suffering, and concludes this being is not morally good. But this creates a kind of catch-22, which the author lays out here. To judge God as not good, you need to have a real objective standard of what good is. So, if you say morality is just a subjective opinion, then calling God immoral is as meaningless as calling the Big Bang rude. It's just your personal taste. But if you say morality is objective and real, then the question becomes, where did that objective standard come from? The argument is that the very existence of a transcendent moral law points toward a transcendent lawgiver. And here we are at the final objection. And it's probably the most common one of all. You know the one. Religion is basically just a security blanket. People believe in God because they need a psychological crutch to cope with the harsh realities of life and death. The author's response here is that this is a classic logical mistake called the genetic fallacy. That's when you try to invalidate a belief by explaining where it came from instead of looking at the evidence for it. And as the slide shows, you can easily turn this logic right back around. You could just as easily say, atheists don't believe in God because they want to escape moral accountability. You see, either way, why someone believes something doesn't tell you whether or not that belief is actually true. So we've walked through all 8 of these common objections and the author's counter-arguments. After all that back and forth, what's the bottom line? What's the final verdict from our source? Well, the author's core claim is that while these objections seem powerful on the surface, they don't really dig deep enough. The final conclusion is that a theistic worldview actually provides a more coherent and satisfying explanation for the biggest features of our reality, things like why the universe exists, why we have a sense of right and wrong, and even our own ability to reason in the first place. And in the end, the author leaves us with this final challenge. It's a question that pushes us past all the arguments and asks us to look inward. Is what I believe, whatever that may be, based on what makes me feel comfortable, or is it based on what I honestly think is true about the world? And that's a question worth thinking about. Thanks for tuning in.